Hello, everyone. Today we're going to step into a story that begins on what seemed like a simple, ordinary morning, but ended in a sentence that cut deeper than any knife. You're no longer my mother. I want you to picture this with me. The sun is streaming through the curtains, but it doesn't feel warm. The house is quiet, almost too quiet. A stack of papers sits on the kitchen table, and beside it, my old checkbook, worn, faded, the ink smudged from years of handling. My coffee has already gone cold, untouched, as if even it knew this day would not bring comfort. In the distance, I hear the ticking of the wall clock, every sound like a drumbeat marching me toward a decision I never imagined I'd have to make. My son, the boy I once held in my arms, the boy I once shielded from every storm, is now standing across from me with eyes I can barely recognize. His voice is sharp, urgent. He's asking for something I cannot give. And deep in my chest, my heart is already trembling, knowing that the moment I say no, something will break forever. But let me back up just slightly, because stories like this don't begin with a single word. They begin with years. Years of sacrifice, years of love, years of quiet hopes that one day, when the wrinkles on my face deepened and my steps slowed, my child would be the one to hold my hand. That was the dream I clung to. And yet, here I was, staring at the end of it all. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And as you listen, I'd love for you to comment below where and when you're watching this story. Because stories like these, stories of heartbreak and resilience, stretch far beyond the walls of one family. I'm 64 years old. I have lived through joy and through loss. I buried my husband 3 years ago, and I thought that was the hardest trial life could put before me. I thought widowhood had already stripped me bare, leaving me only with memories to keep me warm. But nothing could have prepared me for the day my own son would look at me, not as his mother, but as an obstacle. The moment it began was at the bank. I had made my choice after long nights of staring at the ceiling, after sleepless hours of wondering if I could risk my entire future on one desperate request. The savings account that held the last of my security, the fund that was supposed to cover hospital bills, home repairs, maybe even a few small joys in my later years, was about to be closed. I remember the pen trembling in my hand as I signed the final line. The ink felt permanent, binding, like sealing away a piece of my life. My son watched, expecting me to hand the money over to him, expecting me to cave, as I had so many times when he was younger. But when I told him that this account was being closed, not for him, not for his plans, but for my own survival, the look in his eyes changed. It was no longer the gaze of a son. It was anger, raw and heavy. It was disbelief, as if I had betrayed him. And then the words came, sharp enough to slice through every memory of lullabies and birthday candles. You're no longer my mother. The world seemed to stop. The bank teller froze, the sound of a stamp on another customer's form echoing in the silence. My chest tightened, and for a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream that I had given him everything, that every wrinkle on my face was carved by the weight of love and sacrifice for him. But my lips refused to move. All I could do was sit in the hollow quiet, stunned, while the boy I raised turned his back on me. I walked out of that bank with nothing but an empty account and a heart that felt like shattered glass. The autumn wind whipped against my coat as if to remind me that the world outside would not stop to comfort me. Leaves crunched under my shoes, and each step felt heavier than the last. But here's the thing about survival. Even in the most crushing moments, a small voice inside whispers, "Keep going." And so I did. I went home to the same kitchen table where the morning had begun, sat down with trembling hands, and tried to steady my breathing. I was alone, but I was still standing. This was only the beginning, because once those words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. And what followed was not silence, but an unraveling, a storm of betrayal, of whispers, of choices I never wanted to make. This is where the story begins, but not where it ends. In the next part, I will take you back through the years, to the sacrifices that built this fragile bond, and how piece by piece, it was undone. The house feels emptier tonight, though nothing has changed. The furniture is the same, the walls still lined with the faded photographs of family holidays and birthdays. Yet as I sit in the living room, the silence presses down on me like a heavy blanket, and my mind drifts back to the years when I believed sacrifice was enough to secure love. I see myself as a young woman again. Back then, I didn't have much, but I had dreams. I remember long hours standing behind the counter at the grocery store, my feet aching, my back screaming. Every paycheck was smaller than what I needed, but I always found a way to set a little aside. Sometimes it was only $5, sometimes 10. I'd place it carefully into the savings account like a gardener planting a seed, believing that one day it would bloom into security for both of us. Every dollar had a purpose. Some were meant for his education, others for the roof over our heads, and always, always, for the day when I would no longer be strong enough to work. My husband used to tease me gently about my discipline. "Sharon," he would say, "you save like the world is ending tomorrow." And I would smile, because in my heart, I knew the world could end at any time. All I had to cling to was preparation, sacrifice, and hope. I can still hear the clink of coins hitting the bottom of the glass jar on the kitchen counter. That sound used to make me proud. I would tell my son, "This is for you, Brian. One day, you'll understand." He was just a boy then, wide-eyed and curious, asking if he could shake the jar to hear the coins rattle. He didn't understand the weight of those coins, that each one meant I had gone without something for myself. A new dress I didn't buy, a dinner out that never happened, a vacation that stayed only a dream. And I was fine with that. I wanted him to have more than I did. I wanted him to walk into a future where doors opened easily, where opportunities weren't rationed. I think of the school lunches I packed, how I'd slip in an extra apple or a small homemade cookie, even when I couldn't afford treats for myself. I remember saving up for months to buy him his first proper bicycle, watching his face light up as if I had handed him the entire world. Those are the memories that used to warm me. Now they ache, because I wonder, did he ever see what I gave up? Did he ever notice that the new shoes I promised myself never came? Or that the winter coat I wore year after year was patched, not replaced? Sacrifice became my second skin. I wore it proudly. But sacrifice is a strange thing. It is invisible to the very people you make it for. Children grow up thinking the lights always turn on, the fridge is always full, the bills are always paid. They don't see the sleepless nights at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a battlefield. They don't hear the quiet prayers whispered before falling asleep, hoping tomorrow would not bring another crisis. And now, as I replay his words, "You're no longer my mother," I feel as if those years of sacrifice have been erased, as if the ledger of my love was wiped clean with one sentence. It's not just rejection, it's dismissal. It's as though all those coins in the jar, all those choices to go without, meant nothing. The photographs on the wall blur before my eyes as tears rise. I look at the one where he's holding his diploma, my smile stretched wide, my husband's arm around my shoulder. I remember the pride in that moment, the way I whispered to myself, it was worth it. Every hour, every sacrifice, it was worth it, because my son was stepping into a future I had dreamed for him. But tonight, that memory feels different. It feels like a cruel reminder that even the strongest sacrifices cannot guarantee loyalty, cannot buy gratitude. Love, I realize now, cannot be purchased by what we give up. It must be chosen freely, given back willingly. And my son, somewhere along the way, chose differently. Still, even in the heaviness, part of me clings to the truth of who I was, who I still am. I was a mother who sacrificed everything. That cannot be undone, no matter how cruel his words may be. Perhaps he has forgotten, but I have not. And though those memories hurt now, they are also my proof. Proof that I once gave everything for him. The night deepens. The house grows colder. I pull the blanket tighter around me and whisper into the empty room. I tried. I really did. And as sleep slowly pulls me under, I realize this story isn't just about loss. It's about whether years of sacrifice can survive the fire of betrayal, or whether I must build a new life from ashes. The knock on my door came just after dinner. I remember the sound vividly. It wasn't a gentle knock, not the rhythm of a son coming home to visit his mother. It was sharp, hurried, almost impatient. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, and I knew before I even stood up that this wasn't going to be a simple visit. When I opened the door, there he was, my son, Brian. His face carried a tension I hadn't seen in years. His jaw was tight, his eyes restless, and though he tried to smile, the corners of his mouth betrayed him. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pacing the hallway like a man with fire licking at his heels. "Mom," he said quickly, "I need to talk to you." "It's important." I closed the door softly, bracing myself. There was something in his tone that told me this wasn't about sharing good news or catching up. This was about wanting. I had heard that tone before, years ago, when he was younger, when he asked for things I couldn't always afford, but somehow managed to provide. But this time, there was a heaviness to it, a demand wrapped in desperation. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once cut his sandwiches into neat triangles, where I had helped him with homework under the yellow glow of the lamp. Now, the space between us felt like a canyon. He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes at first. "Mom, things aren't good. I've been dealing with some financial problems. It's temporary, just temporary, but I need your help." The words landed heavily, though they weren't unexpected. I had seen the signs, the late-night phone calls he avoided, the sudden hush in his voice when I asked about work, the distracted look in his eyes when we met for Sunday dinners. Still, hearing him say it out loud tightened something deep in my chest. "How bad is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, then leaned forward, his eyes finally locking onto mine. "I need a large sum, Mom, 100,000. Just a loan, I swear. I'll pay you back as soon as I get things back on track." 100,000. The number rang in my ears like a bell-tolling doom. My hands gripped the edge of the table, the wood pressing into my skin. That account, the savings account he was talking about, wasn't just money. It was my security. It was the last safeguard between me and the uncertainties of old age. I swallowed hard. "Brian, that's not something I can just give. That's everything I have left. That money was meant for emergencies, for the future." His expression hardened instantly. "This is an emergency. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. If I don't fix this, everything falls apart." I wanted to believe him. God knows, I wanted to believe that my son had simply stumbled, that he just needed a hand to steady himself. But something in his eyes made me pause. There was no humility, no gratitude, only expectation, like this was not a request, but a demand. I took a breath. "Brian, I love you, but I can't give you that money. It would mean putting myself in danger. I can't risk everything I've saved, everything your father and I worked for." His chair scraped back against the floor as he stood abruptly, anger flaring across his face. "Danger? Mom, you're exaggerating. You've got the house, you've got assets. You can take out a loan. This isn't about risk, it's about you trusting me." Those words stung, because for a moment I questioned myself. Was I being too cautious? Too cold? But then I remembered the long nights, the sacrifices, the promise I had made to myself after Harold passed, that I would not let our years of saving vanish into someone else's recklessness. I tried to reach across the table, my hand trembling. "Brian, please, let's talk about this. Maybe there's another way, maybe smaller steps." But he pulled back, his voice rising. "Another way? There's no other way. Either you help me now or you don't. And if you don't, then what does that say about you as a mother?" The words hit like a slap. What does it say about me as a mother? My throat closed, my heart hammered. I had spent my entire life proving my love through sacrifice, and yet, in his eyes, all of it was measured only by the balance of my bank account. The air between us turned suffocating. The man in front of me was not the boy I raised. He was a stranger whose desperation had turned into accusation. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a request. It was the beginning of a test, one that would break us both in ways neither of us could have imagined. The bank smelled of paper and polish, that sterile mix of ink and disinfectant that always made me feel small. The floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every step echoing louder than it should. My purse felt heavy against my arm, though inside it carried little more than the checkbook that had seen me through decades of careful saving. Brian walked 2 paces ahead of me, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He hadn't said much on the drive over, only short-clipped words that carried the weight of his impatience. I tried to search his face for the boy I once knew, the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, the boy who once cried when he lost his favorite toy. But all I saw now was urgency, edged with anger. We sat across from a young teller whose smile didn't reach her eyes. She tapped the keyboard with efficient clicks, her eyes flicking between us and the screen. "So, you're closing the account today?" she asked brightly, as though she were asking about a haircut appointment. I nodded, forcing my lips into something resembling composure. My hands were trembling beneath the desk, hidden from view. I felt Brian's gaze burning into me, as though he could will me into doing what he wanted simply by glaring hard enough. "Yes," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "I need to close it." The teller slid the forms toward me. The papers seemed to stretch forever, line after line, asking for signatures, initials, confirmation. Each page was a reminder of how final this choice would be. My pen hovered above the paper, and for a fleeting second, I thought of stopping, of pushing the forms back and walking out. But then I remembered the late nights counting every penny with Harold, the whispered promises to myself that I would be safe in old age. This money wasn't for extravagance, it was for survival. I signed the first line. The scratch of the pen echoed in my ears like thunder. Brian shifted in his seat, exhaling sharply through his nose. I signed the second line. By the third, my hands had steadied, but my heart hammered with every stroke of ink. When the last page was signed, the teller gathered the forms, stamped them briskly, and gave me a receipt. "Your account is officially closed. The balance will be available in the form of a cashier's check," she said, placing the slip in front of me. I stared at it. That piece of paper represented 40 years of sacrifice, scrimping and saving, going without so that I could feel safe. It was supposed to carry me through illness, through old age, through the years when my body would no longer cooperate. And here it sat, fragile, in the hands of someone who did not see its meaning, only its number. Brian leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Hand it to me." I swallowed hard. "Brian, I told you. This money isn't going to solve your problems. Giving it to you would destroy everything I've worked for." His eyes widened, disbelief turning quickly into fury. The flush crept up his neck, and before I could say another word, he pushed back his chair so hard it scraped against the marble floor, drawing a few stares from nearby customers. "You're unbelievable," he spat, his voice rising now. "All these years, I thought you were different. But you're selfish. You care more about your precious money than about your own son." I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer. "Brian, He cut me off, his words like knives. "You're no longer my mother." The bank fell silent. Even the teller froze, her hands hovering mid-motion. I felt the air leave my lungs as though he had struck me. My ears rang, and for a moment the world blurred, the people around us becoming shadows. No longer his mother. The boy I raised, the man I had sacrificed everything for, had severed me with a sentence. I sat there, staring at the son who no longer claimed me, my hands clutching the thin slip of paper as though it were the only anchor keeping me from floating away. He turned and stormed out, the glass doors swinging violently behind him. And just like that, the bond I had, believed unbreakable, was fractured beyond recognition. I remained in the chair for several minutes, unable to move, the teller shifting uncomfortably in the silence. Finally, I gathered my things, stood on unsteady legs, and walked toward the exit. The sunlight outside was blinding. The city noises rushed back in. Car horns, footsteps, voices. But they felt distant, muffled, as though I had stepped into another world. A world where I was no longer a mother, no longer the person I had spent my life being. The cashier's check was clutched tightly in my hand, but it didn't feel like security anymore. It felt like a curse, a symbol of the chasm that now stretched between me and the only child I had. And as I walked away from the bank, one thought circled relentlessly in my mind. How did we get here? That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was dark, the clock ticking steadily on the wall, but inside my head there was only one sound. His voice. Harsh, sharp, final. You're no longer my mother. It echoed in the quiet, louder than the creak of the old wooden floor, louder than the rustle of the curtains in the draft. I turned over in bed again and again, clutching the blanket to my chest, as though it could muffle the memory. But it clung to me, stubborn as a shadow. The words didn't just hurt, they carved themselves into my very bones. How many times had that voice once called me Mom, with love, with laughter, with trust? How many times had he whispered it as a child, afraid of the dark, or cried it out when he scraped his knees? Now, the same voice had used the word to cut me away, to declare me no longer worthy of the title I had built my entire life around. I rose from bed, pacing the hallway. My reflection caught me in the mirror, my face pale, my eyes hollow, my shoulders bent under invisible weight. I whispered it out loud, testing the sound. No longer your mother. The words tasted bitter, foreign, yet somehow real. In the kitchen, I sat with a cup of tea I didn't drink. The steam curled upward, dissolving quickly into the air, just like my certainty about who I was. My identity had been wrapped around motherhood for so long that without it, I felt like a ghost in my own home. The echoes followed me everywhere. When I looked at the family photographs on the wall, his words whispered again, "You're no longer my mother." When I touched the worn handle of the refrigerator, remembering the meals I had cooked for him, they surfaced once more. You're no longer my mother. Even outside, the reminders haunted me. Passing the playground where I once pushed him on the swings, the laughter of other children made the words strike again. No longer your mother. Each echo struck deeper, like a hammer against glass, cracking but never quite shattering me. I tried to reason with myself. He was angry. He didn't mean it. People say things they regret. But the problem was, I had seen his eyes. Anger burns fast, but his gaze had been cold, detached, final. There had been no flicker of regret, no stumble in his tone. He had said it with conviction, as though cutting me out of his life was the solution to his problems. That realization was the sharpest cut of all. I went to the garden the next morning, hoping the routine would steady me. The soil was damp from last night's rain, the air fresh with the scent of earth. I pressed my hands into the dirt, pulling weeds, trimming the edges, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of care. But even there, in the quiet sanctuary I had built, the words returned. With each tug of a root, with each clip of the shears, his voice slithered back. Neighbors waved as they walked by. One asked how I was doing, and I smiled politely, hiding the storm inside. Because how could I explain? How could I tell them that the very title of mother, the role that defined me, had been stripped away not by strangers, not by fate, but by my own child? In moments of silence, I tried to remember his younger days, his first steps, his laughter echoing through the house, the nights he curled up next to me after nightmares. I repeated those memories to myself like prayers, desperate to drown out the new echo. But no matter how hard I tried, the cruel sentence always returned. You're no longer my mother. It was like standing in a canyon, shouting into the emptiness, only to have the same words thrown back at me from every direction. They filled my head when I tried to cook, when I tried to rest, even when I tried to pray. The echo wasn't just his rejection, it was the sound of something breaking inside me. The realization that love, no matter how deeply given, can be severed in an instant. I wanted to scream back, to demand, who gave you the right to take that from me? Who are you to erase a lifetime with a single sentence? But there was no one to answer, only silence, only the echo. As night fell again, I sat by the window, staring at the stars. Somewhere beyond those glittering points of light was the boy I had raised, now a man lost in his own anger. I wondered if he too heard echoes, if my face, my sacrifices, haunted him, or had he already silenced me completely in his heart? The echo of his words had become my companion, and I realized with a chill that this was only the beginning, because once spoken, such words have a way of rewriting everything that comes after. News in families doesn't travel quietly. It spreads in whispers, in raised eyebrows, in careful pauses when I walk into the room. Within days, what had happened at the bank, the confrontation, the words, the fracture, had rippled through my relatives like a stone dropped into still water. It began with a phone call from my sister. Her voice was hesitant, carrying that mix of concern and judgment only family can manage. "I heard there was a disagreement," she said, tiptoeing around the word. Disagreement. As if my son disowning me in a public place was no more than a squabble about what to serve at dinner. Then came the relatives with opinions, each one convinced they knew the truth better than I did. Some said I had been too hard, that as a mother, I should have found a way to help him, no matter the cost. "Isn't that what mothers are for?" one cousin asked pointedly over Sunday lunch, her words laced with accusation. Others, usually those who had walked the road of betrayal themselves, quietly told me I was right to protect what little I had left. But it wasn't just family. Neighbors began to take sides as well. At the grocery store, Mrs. Patterson stopped me by the fruit display, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't mean to pry, but I heard your Brian had some financial trouble. Poor boy. You know, young men these days, they just need support." Her eyes softened, but her words carried an undertone that made me feel guilty, as though I had abandoned him. Yet on the same day, outside the bakery, another neighbor squeezed my hand firmly. "Don't you dare feel guilty," she said with quiet force. "You've given him enough. If he's drowning, it's because of his own choices, not yours." Her support warmed me, but it also deepened the divide, because for every person who defended me, another shook their head behind my back, convinced I was the villain of the story. Family gatherings became unbearable. At a birthday dinner for my niece, conversation stopped when I entered the room. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring, judging, some pitying, others disapproving. My son wasn't there, but his absence was louder than any words. When someone finally asked about him, I simply smiled weakly and changed the subject. Behind closed doors, though, the accusations were sharper. A distant aunt called me late one evening, her voice harsh through the static of the old phone line. "You know," she said, "money can be replaced. Family cannot. You should have given him what he asked for. You pushed him away." I bit my tongue, tears stinging my eyes, because how could I explain that it wasn't about the money? It was about survival. That $100,000 wasn't a luxury. It was the line between security and destitution. But people didn't want explanations. They wanted someone to blame. And I was an easy target. Even my church, once a sanctuary, became another battlefield of quiet judgment. After service, a group of women huddled near the entrance, their voices dropping as I walked past. I caught fragments. Mother, money, shame, and though they pretended not to notice me, I felt the sting of their words. The house of worship no longer felt like a refuge, but another place where my wounds were on display. It was in these moments that I realized betrayal doesn't end with the person who betrays you. It bleeds into every corner of your life, staining relationships you thought were safe. My son's rejection had created fault lines in the entire family, forcing people to choose sides, forcing me to defend myself against people who once loved me. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, the sympathetic tones that felt like pity, the harsh words that accused me of being cold, the silence from those who didn't know what to say. Each one was its own kind of wound. But beneath the judgment one truth gnawed at me. My son wasn't defending me. He wasn't telling anyone that I had sacrificed for him, that I had given him everything I could. No, he was painting himself as the victim, and me as the cruel mother who turned her back. And people were believing him. The division cut deeper than I expected. Not only was I losing my son, but I was losing the image of myself I had held within the family. I was no longer the dependable mother, the selfless figure people admired. I had become, in some eyes, a miserly woman clinging to her money at the expense of love. It's strange how quickly love turns into judgment, how loyalty crumbles under the weight of gossip. In those weeks, I learned that betrayal doesn't just separate two people. It fractures an entire circle, leaving cracks that may never mend. And as I lay awake at night, the voices of family and neighbors swirling in my head, one thought rose above the noise. If even blood could divide against me, what did I have left? The nights became the hardest part. Daytime was easier, in its own cruel way. I could distract myself with chores, watering the garden, folding laundry, sweeping the same hallway twice just to keep my hands busy. Even the uncomfortable stares of neighbors or the whispered judgments of relatives were easier to bear than the silence that descended when the world went to sleep. Because at night, there was no distraction, only me, the darkness, and the relentless echo of my own thoughts. I would lie in bed, the ceiling above me an empty canvas for memories and doubts. The words my son had hurled, "You're no longer my mother," played again and again, each repetition slicing deeper. And yet, in those hours when the house was still, my mind twisted the knife further by asking questions I had no answers for. Was I too harsh? Should I have given in just once more? What kind of mother denies her son? I told myself the truth over and over, that the money was all I had left, that surrendering it would have left me defenseless, that enabling him would not have saved him but only sunk us both. I knew this in my bones, but at 3 a.m, truth feels fragile. Guilt swells larger than reason. Sometimes I would get up and wander through the house in the dark, my bare feet padding softly against the wooden floors. The photographs on the walls seemed to glow in the moonlight, each one a reminder of the boy I raised. There he was on his first day of school, backpack too large for his tiny shoulders. There he was at graduation, eyes bright with possibility. There he was on his wedding day, smiling as though the world had finally given him everything he wanted. And then the doubts would whisper again. What happened? Where did I lose him? I would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, remembering the countless meals we had shared there. Nights when he told me about his dreams of becoming successful, of building a life bigger than anything I could imagine. I used to sit there and believe him, my heart swelling with pride. Now I sat there alone, tracing circles on the tabletop, wondering if all those dreams had curdled into resentment. The loneliness pressed in on me like a weight. Some nights I tried to pray, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I whispered to the empty room as though someone might answer. Did I do the right thing? Am I the monster they think I am? There were no answers. Only the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the old house settling. And then came the fear, the quiet dread of what lay ahead. Without my son, who would be there when I grew older, when illness came, when my body finally gave out? Would I die alone in this house, remembered not as a mother who loved too much, but as one who refused when it mattered most? The nights magnified those fears. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like abandonment. Every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like a reminder that I was alone. But amid the doubt, something else stirred. A stubborn flicker deep within me, refusing to be extinguished. On some nights, I clung to it like a lifeline. It whispered that survival sometimes requires saying no, that love does not mean self-destruction. It reminded me of the promise I had made to Harold, my late husband, to take care of myself, even when it was hard. Still, the tug of war inside me never ceased. Reason against guilt, strength against fear. The mother I had been against the woman I was forced to become. By dawn, I would often find myself exhausted, hollow-eyed, sitting by the window as the first light crept over the horizon. The birds would begin to sing, and for a moment the world felt normal again. But as the day stretched forward, I knew the nights would return, bringing with them the same haunting questions. Was I a mother protecting herself, or a mother who had failed? The nights gave no answer, only silence, only doubt. And yet, somehow, I endured them, because deep down, I sensed this story was far from over. Whispers have a way of growing louder when you pretend not to hear them. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, that the sideways glances in the grocery store, the sudden hush when I walked into church, were coincidences. But soon, it became undeniable. My private heartbreak had become a public scandal. The first sting came at the market. I was picking through apples when I overheard two women a few feet away. Their voices dropped just low enough to seem discreet, but not low enough to hide. "That's her, isn't it? The one who refused her son?" the younger one said. The older replied, "Mm-hmm. Imagine choosing money over family." The words burned, and I wanted to turn, to shout that they didn't know the whole story, that survival isn't selfish. But instead, I stood frozen, an apple clutched in my hand until my knuckles went white. I placed it back and left the store without finishing my shopping. At church, the weight grew heavier. Church had always been my refuge, the one place where the hymns lifted my spirit and the faces around me felt like extended family. But now, even there, I felt the sting of judgment. I noticed the way conversations stopped when I approached, the subtle distance people kept as though my grief might be contagious. After one Sunday service, a woman I had known for years leaned close as she shook my hand. "I'll pray for you," she whispered. It should have been comforting, but her eyes told another story. Pity laced with reproach. As though my refusal to yield to Brian was a sin in itself, the gossip didn't stop at whispered words. It seeped into the way people treated me. Some neighbors who once greeted me warmly now offered tight, polite nods. Others looked away altogether, unwilling to meet my gaze. Even the cashier at the corner store, who used to ask about my garden, now rushed through the transaction, her smile strained. What hurt most wasn't the strangers. It was the people I had known for years. Families we had shared barbecues with, women I had sat beside at community meetings, friends who had once called me sister in spirit. One by one, they pulled back, their silence speaking louder than their words ever could. One afternoon, I walked past a group of teenagers sitting on a porch. They weren't subtle. "That's the lady," one of them muttered. "Her son says she chose money over him." They laughed, a sharp, careless sound that sliced deeper than they could have known. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, cheeks burning with shame I didn't deserve. It was as if I were standing trial in a courtroom with no defense attorney, no chance to tell my side. The verdict had already been passed. Guilty. Guilty of valuing money more than family. Guilty of being cold, unloving, selfish. At night, when the house was silent, I replayed these encounters. Their words nested inside me, feeding the doubts that already kept me awake. It wasn't just my son's rejection anymore. It was the community's judgment, pressing down until I questioned my very worth. And yet, in the midst of the harsh voices, there were glimmers of kindness. A neighbor left fresh bread on my doorstep without a word. The librarian smiled warmly when I came in, sliding across a book on resilience, as though she had chosen it just for me. A kind man at church touched my shoulder gently and said, "Don't let them talk you down. Only you know the truth." Those moments were small, but they mattered. They reminded me that not everyone believed the whispers. Still, the balance was uneven. Support was quiet, but judgment was loud. And it was the loudness that followed me, echoing in every corner of my daily life. I began avoiding places I once loved. The bakery with its sweet smell of cinnamon rolls, the community center where I used to join knitting circles, even the park bench where Harold and I had once sat in companionable silence. Each space now carried the risk of another stare, another whisper, another reminder that I was no longer just Sharon. I was the woman who refused her son. The cruelest part of gossip is how it reduces you to a single story, stripping away the complexity, the sacrifices, the truth. I wasn't Sharon, the widow who had raised her child through lean years. I wasn't Sharon, the neighbor who tended her garden with care. I wasn't Sharon, the friend who listened late into the night. I was only the mother who said no. And in that label, the community found its judgment. Still, beneath the sting of their words, something inside me began to shift. If I was going to be branded, then I would have to decide what story I told myself. Because if I let their whispers define me, I would vanish into shame. But if I clung to my truth, maybe, just maybe, I could survive their judgment. It was by accident that I first caught a glimpse of his other life, the one hidden behind closed doors and carefully chosen words. One afternoon, I stopped by the library. The walls there always comforted me. They smelled of paper and dust, a reminder of steadiness in a world that had begun to tilt. I didn't expect to see Brian's name anywhere, but as I browsed the computer lab, I overheard two men whispering about a real estate deal gone wrong, about a young man drowning in debt. My heart jolted when one of them said his name. I shouldn't have listened, but I did. And when I left the library that day, I couldn't shake the urge to find out more. It wasn't distrust. It was desperation to understand what had driven my son to look me in the eye and cut me out of his heart. That night, I opened the internet at home. My fingers shook as I typed his name into search bars, into social platforms I barely understood. And there it was, photo after photo, post after post, painting a life that felt like a stranger's. Expensive dinners with plates too pretty to eat, vacations to sunny beaches, cocktails balanced in his hand, designer clothes, luxury cars, smiling selfies with friends who looked more like shadows of opportunity than real companions. I sat back, stunned. Each image was time-stamped, each one recent, most within the last 2 years. 2 years when he had grown more distant, more distracted at family dinners, always too busy to linger in conversation. I had thought it was simply adulthood pulling him away. But no, it was this life, this performance of wealth that he had clung to while the foundation beneath him cracked. Scrolling further, I saw the comments, people praising his lifestyle, envying the gloss of it. None of them knew the truth, that it was borrowed, fragile, funded by debts that grew like weeds. The confirmation came when I found the mortgage records. My hands trembled as I followed the breadcrumb trail of documents, each one cold and factual. The house I had given him as a wedding gift, paid in full, no mortgage, now carried a staggering debt. He had refinanced it, drained its value, turned my gift into another tool for reckless spending. I couldn't breathe. I set the papers aside, pressed my hands to my face, and whispered into the silence. "What have you done, Brian?" It wasn't just numbers on a page. It was betrayal carved into my very bones. Every dollar he squandered was a dollar built from the hours I had bent my back at work, the nights I had gone without. He hadn't just mismanaged money, he had dismantled trust. Later that week, at the grocery store, I saw him. He didn't notice me at first. He was outside in the parking lot, talking on the phone, pacing, his voice sharp. I stayed hidden, watching. His shoulders slumped as he muttered words that chilled me. "I can't pay it this month. Tell them I'll figure it out. I just need more time." There it was, the truth spilling from his own mouth. The debts weren't whispers anymore. They were chains, dragging him deeper every day. I should have walked away, but I couldn't. I approached, softly calling his name. He turned, startled, his face flashing with irritation, before smoothing into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, didn't expect to see you here." I asked how he was, and he shrugged, brushing it off. "Fine, busy. You know how it is." But I knew better. I could see the exhaustion in his face, the worry etched around his eyes. And yet, even then, he didn't admit the truth. He didn't ask for understanding, for forgiveness. He simply carried on the charade, as though the cracks weren't visible to anyone looking closely. That night, I sat awake, piecing together the fragments. The social media posts, the overheard conversations, the mortgage documents. Together, they told a story more devastating than any insult he had hurled. My son wasn't just struggling, he was drowning, and he was willing to drag me down with him, rather than face the consequences himself. The realization pierced me with equal parts sorrow and anger. This wasn't the life I had dreamed for him, the one I had built my sacrifices upon. This was a hollow performance, a mask built of borrowed money and false pride. And yet, underneath all of it, he was still my son. The boy I had once tucked into bed, the boy whose laughter had filled this very house. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the sky pale with morning light, torn between heartbreak and fury. The truth was now inescapable. My son had not only rejected me, he had betrayed everything I had given him. In the weeks after discovering the truth about Brian's life, I expected only silence or judgment. I braced myself for more whispers, more sideways glances, more people treating me as though I had chosen greed over love. What I did not expect was kindness, from places I had long overlooked, from people I had never thought of as allies. It began with Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor 2 doors down. She was a quiet woman, widowed like me, who tended her roses with meticulous care. We rarely exchanged more than polite greetings, but one morning, as I struggled to carry groceries up the steps, she appeared at my side, her arms surprisingly strong for her age. "Let me help," she said simply, lifting half the bags before I could protest. We set them down in the kitchen together, and for the first time in years, she stayed. Over cups of tea, she listened, truly listened, as I told her everything. I expected judgment, but her eyes held only compassion. "I've seen how he treats you," she said gently. "Don't let them convince you you're wrong for protecting yourself. You've carried him long enough." Her words sank deep, steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Then came Margaret, an old friend I hadn't spoken to since Harold's funeral. She called out of the blue, her voice crackling through the phone line like a forgotten melody. "I heard what happened," she said softly. My chest tightened, ready for reproach. But instead, she sighed. "You know, when my son borrowed money from me, it nearly ruined us both. Sometimes saying no is the greatest act of love." I cried after that call, not from sorrow, but from relief. To know I wasn't alone, that someone else had walked a similar road, lifted a piece of the burden. Even strangers seemed to sense my struggle. At the library, the same place where I had uncovered the painful truth of Brian's debts, a librarian slipped a book into my hands without a word. The cover read, "Rising Strong." I don't know if she knew my story or if it was chance, but the gesture felt like a quiet blessing. One afternoon, as I worked in the garden, a young man passing by stopped to admire the flowers. "My mom loved roses," he said, his voice tinged with memory. We struck up a conversation, and somehow, within minutes, I found myself confessing more than I intended. He listened, then nodded. "Mothers carry the weight of the world, but people forget you're human too. Don't let guilt bury you." He smiled before walking away, leaving me standing among the roses, stunned by the wisdom of a stranger. These small moments added up. They didn't erase the pain of my son's rejection, nor did they silence the gossip swirling through the community. But they reminded me of something essential, that compassion still existed, that not everyone saw me as a villain. The most unexpected ally of all came in the form of Pastor Williams. I had avoided church for weeks, too ashamed to sit among those who whispered. But one evening, as I walked past the chapel, he caught sight of me. His voice carried across the steps. "Sharon." I froze, ready for judgment. Instead, he walked toward me, his expression kind. "I've heard things," he said, "but I want you to know. The truth isn't found in gossip. It's found in the choices you make when no one is watching. You've lived a life of sacrifice. One decision doesn't erase that." He placed a hand on my shoulder, steady as stone. "Don't let their words define you. I left the chapel that night with tears streaming down my face, not from shame, but from the comfort of being seen. Slowly, these allies, neighbors, friends, strangers, became threads holding me together. They reminded me that even when family turns away, even when your community falters, humanity has a way of reaching out from the unlikeliest places. It struck me then, betrayal can isolate you, but it also reveals who truly stands by you, and sometimes those people are not the ones you expected. As I watered the garden one evening, the setting sun casting golden light across the yard, I realized I was not entirely alone. I still had allies, still had voices reminding me of my worth. And in their kindness, I found the first fragile roots of strength beginning to grow again. There are moments when grief doesn't come from death, but from realizing someone you love has become a stranger. That is how I felt every time I thought of Brian. I often caught myself wandering into the past, like an old woman leafing through a photo album in her mind. And in those quiet hours, I could still see the boy he once was. I remembered the little boy who used to run down the hallway in pajamas, his laughter ringing like music against the walls. The boy who would jump into my lap after scraping his knee, tears on his cheeks but trust in his eyes, certain that in my arms he would be safe. The boy who used to press his tiny hand into mine and say, "Don't ever let go, Mom." That boy was tender, curious, hopeful. He believed in goodness, in fairness, in the magic of bedtime stories. He was my joy, my purpose, my reason to push through endless shifts at the store, my reason to save every coin, my reason to endure when exhaustion pressed me down. But that boy was gone. The man who now stood before me carried none of that innocence. His eyes were guarded, suspicious, laced with anger. His smile, when it came, was strained, shaped more by performance than by joy. He had learned how to manipulate, how to twist words until they cut, how to make guilt a weapon. I tried to reconcile the two versions, the child I had raised and the man I now faced. But it was like trying to bridge two worlds separated by an unscalable wall. One belonged to memory, warm and untainted. The other belonged to the present, cold and sharp. There were nights I sat with old photo albums spread across the table. I'd trace his face in the pictures, my finger running along the edges of his smile. Birthday parties with balloons tied to chairs. School plays where he wore costumes too big for his small frame. High school graduation, the pride in his eyes, as he clutched his diploma. Each picture told me, "You raised him well, you gave him everything." So how did we arrive here? How did the boy who once clung to me in fear become the man who declared I was no longer his mother? Sometimes I blamed myself. Had I been too protective? Too indulgent? Did I make it too easy for him to believe that money, not love, was the measure of care? Other times I blamed the world. The pressure to succeed, the hunger for appearances, the insatiable appetite of a society that tells young men they must look powerful, even if it's borrowed power. But no matter where I placed the blame, the pain remained the same. Because grief doesn't bargain with reason. It just lingers, heavy and unrelenting. I remembered his wedding day, how handsome he looked, how my heart swelled as I handed him the keys to the house I had worked so hard to gift him. I thought then that I was giving him security, a foundation to build a family on. I didn't realize I was also giving him the rope he would later use to bind himself to debt and destruction. The hardest part wasn't losing the money. It was losing the son I thought I knew. I thought about the last real hug we shared, years ago after Harold's funeral. Brian had held me tightly, tears spilling onto my shoulder, whispering that he would take care of me now. For a brief moment, I believed him. For a brief moment, I thought my sacrifices had come full circle, that my son was ready to become the man his father had hoped he would be. But that promise faded, and in its place grew the man who now saw me as nothing more than a bank he could withdraw from, and who, when denied, severed me with a sentence. Some nights, the memories of the boy I raised comforted me. Other nights, they tortured me, because I knew that boy still lived somewhere deep inside him, buried under pride and anger, and I feared I would never see him again. I whispered his name sometimes in the dark. "Brian," I said softly, as though calling out to the child who once believed I was his world. But the silence that answered told me the truth. That boy was gone, and the man who remained had chosen another path. And that realization was its own kind of death.